Okay, we'll go ahead and get on with our next speaker of the day is Scott Lukas. Scott is also a new scientist that's coming to the experiment station here in Hermiston. Came in here in September. He's the horticulturist here. And Scott's talk today is going to be the use of pesticides in vegetation management.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all for sticking around. I know you all want to learn about pesticide labels. It has nothing to do with the core credits, right? You're all here to hear this talk. I'm glad we had a break because I see some cups of coffee out there. I know it's a hard time of day to keep your heads up and keep your eyes open, so we'll try to keep you awake as much as we can with this pretty thrilling topic here. So as Tim mentioned, I've been with Herrick at the experiment station for maybe about 3 months now. I came from the University of Hawaii, in which I spent about the last year, 10 years, and I was doing weed science for about half of that time, looking at pre-emergent chemical technologies, post-emergent, systemic sprays, trying to really maximize chemical efficiencies while establishing a target crop. So we're doing a lot of seed production and crop production optimization using chemical technologies. So I've been doing this for a while. I've done a lot of training classes with Department of Transportation. So that's why they asked me to cover this topic today. But now I'm moving into a slightly different shift, not primarily focused on weed science. So I'll be responsible for the horticultural crops in the area, looking at essentially the specialty crops. So potatoes doesn't fall under my jurisdiction, and I know potatoes is a big crop in the region. But the other crops like onions, blueberries, wine grapes, carrots, peas, beans, all of those are under the HORT program. So with this, I also just wanted to introduce myself to all of you since I'm new here and to make the connections. I have cards up here as well if you want to pick one up when you're done. So what we're going to talk about today, this is going to be a lot of review. And generally review maybe isn't that important, but for this topic, this is about safety. And this is about understanding and being very confident when you look at a pesticide label, because these are things that we apply pretty commonly. And a lot of times when you have that repetition, you take it for granted or you don't really take it seriously as you should. So this is an important aspect to review just so it's fresh and it's at the front of your mind. So what we're going to talk about is just what is a pesticide, some of the definitions, some of the responsibilities associated when you're using these chemicals. And then we're going to look at some of the key components of a pesticide label. Really, they're all contained within the first couple of pages. Labels can be 10, 12, 15 pages long, but we're just going to look at the first couple of pages. And I've handed out some of just an example label, a Garlon 3A, as well as another handout we'll talk about later. So we'll talk about the general statements, ingredients, signal words, some of the PPE, which will be deferred to Tim. His presentation will focus on that more than mine. And then a couple other components. And we're going to shift gears slightly towards the end, and we're going to talk about chemical drift, because this is an important aspect to realize, and it is mentioned on the label. So we're just going to talk about some different ways to try to reduce chemical drift, specifically looking at nozzle technologies. So, pretty basic information here. What is a pesticide? If you break it down, Latin, CIDE, side is to kill. So to kill a pest essentially is what this is. So the three basic reasons are to destroy, to prevent, and to repel a pest. And pretty straightforward information. So this is insecticides, herbicides, miticides. There's a whole range. It could even come down to nitrogen stabilizers in soil. So the reason I list all of these, and I like to say them all, is because I was at a DOT meeting in Hawaii, and it was with a district engineer, and he had a couple hundred people underneath him, and we were talking about work protection standards, and we were laying out how we're going to give this training session, and he said, oh, well, we don't need to comply with the worker protection standards because we're just applying herbicides. We're not using pesticides. So it doesn't quite work. Herbicides is under that umbrella of pesticides, so I like to mention it anyways just to make sure we're all on the same page here. And these are all basically, you could determine if it's a pesticide by the EPA registration number. Clearly on the label there will be an EPA reg number, and that will give you an indication that it is a pesticide. There are certain instances where this isn't always the case, but for the most part, the EPA reg number will cue you off. And misuse of these can cause environmental issues, off-target, non-target crop damage, as well as be a safety hazard for you and your coworkers. And really what this boils down to is that if there is reports of the chemical being used improperly, used too much, used wrong rates, or injuries, all it's going to do is, one, make the chemical not as effective, or they're going to put restrictions on it, and we're going to lose these the available chemistries that are important to us. So misuse is just going to cause less available chemistry technology for us to use. So it's within our best interest to be following these label guidelines. So whose responsibility is it when we have a pesticide or we are going to apply or handle or transport? It is the handler. So whether you pick it up from the store and you're driving it back to your farm, the handler, it's your responsibility. Whether you're mixing it, it's your responsibility. And what this means is that when you have the product in your possession, you are responsible for understanding what's on that label. And it's your duty to try to comprehend it and then follow those guidelines for whatever application you're using. And they're also set by the Oregon Pesticide Law, the Worker Protection Standards, and the EPA plays a big role in these restrictions and regulations as well. So essentially what I mean by this is that the label is the law. What you're holding in front of you is the legally defined guidelines for safe use of these chemicals and pesticides. So with that being said, well, who enforces this? What happens when there is an infraction or you have a complaint, someone reports you? That comes down to the Oregon Department of Ag. And they will use the label and ask you questions in terms of, well, how much did you calibrate? What are your mixing rates? How much did you apply? And that label that you have in front of you will be the rubric that they follow in terms of an inspection. So this is what I mean by the label is the law. So what we're going to do today is, I mentioned we're going to look at these key topics. We're just going to use a Roundup example. I'm not endorsing or saying anything bad about the product. We're just going to use it strictly as an example so we could follow through some of these key sections here. I know it's small and you don't really need to read this. It's just going to illustrate where we're going in terms of the label here. So what we see at the very top is this attention. So what this is basically what I just said. It's the label is the law. These 7 points that you see here are almost a repetition of the same concept. The first is the pesticide product may not be available or approved for sale in your area. It's your responsibility to follow all federal, state, local laws regarding, and this goes on and on. So they're just reiterating the same aspect here that follow the label, follow the rules. Then we have the trade name and then the mode of action. So this is a really important aspect to consider when we're using not only herbicides but all pesticides, is that, as Alex mentioned in the previous presentation, the group number and that classification is fundamental for reducing the risk of resistance. And resistance is a real problem that we're all faced with, and we have to be conscious about how we use these chemicals so we try to reduce that risk. So what we see for this Roundup label, this is a group 9 herbicide. So what does that mean? Essentially, when it gives these group numbers, it's the biochemical pathway or the mode of action, the actual target that that chemical attacks in the plant pathway or the insect pathway. So it could go after a protein synthesis, amino acids, a photosynthesis pathway. It's the specific way in which the chemical functions and does its dirty work, whatever it might be inside the plant. Another aspect of this little block here is the EPA registration number. So granted, we all know that Roundup is an herbicide and a pesticide, but if it were something, say a mosquito repellent, we might not think of that as a pesticide. But if it has that EPA registration number, then that cues you off again to know that, yes, this is a pesticide and you should be treating it as it is. And again, we see another disclaimer about read the entire label before using this product. And this sounds like a broken record, but it's because they say it in almost every aspect of this label. So clearly, this is something to be following. So a little more detail on the mode of action here. So we saw the Roundup is the group 9, and the group 9 here is the EPSP. It's a shikimate pathway, so it's essentially an amino acid pathway, as I was mentioning before. And the reason I put this illustration up here is because you're not intended to memorize these. You're not supposed to know that a group 4 is a synthetic auxin inhibitor. These charts are readily available online. There are numerous resources, so you don't have to memorize this information. The literature is out there, so you could just review to a chart like this and see what the pathway or the mode of action is. And we see there are a lot of different mode of actions, so we want to be sure that we are rotating these group numbers within our tank mixes for one. If you're mixing 2 chemicals together, we don't want to have 2 of the same group numbers. And also if you're doing the chemical rotations, which I hope we're all doing, is that we're not doing 2 group 9s back to back or 2 group 4s back to back. We want to make sure that we're alternating this crop rotation. So how many of you are actually spraying on a regular basis? Are you all growers and you're all applying chemicals? For the most part, this side was pretty active. What about you guys? No? Yes? Okay, we have like a after lunch haze of partial yeses. So I'm assuming you are because you're getting the core credits, but we'll go with that. So anyways, we want to make sure that we see this group number rotating between our tank mixes and our rotational applications. Same with insecticides, herbicides, it's the same idea. The colors are just a notation to help differentiate. Yeah, so there's no, as far as I know, there's no specific reason for the colors, but I believe it's just a differentiation between the difference. And some of them, you see the same colors. It will be, so like 5, 6, and 7, they're different groups, they're different chemical families, but they're all within the photosystem 2 inhibitors. So that's why each one is not a different color.
So you can use like 3 and 15 in different cycles then? Or would you want to go with a different?
You would want to try to rotate out of that chemical family as far as you can. Okay. So you would want to be trying to stay away from those colors. Okay. So we have these 2 products here, Dual Magnum, Outlook. Dual Magnum is metachlor, and the Outlook is dimethenamide. Can we tank mix these? Is that a good idea? What do we think? Okay, yeah, so aside for, yes, doing the jar test to see if they react or form a precipitate, but what about just in terms of a resistance cycle? They're different active ingredients, metachlor and dimethylene, different trade names. We don't know with this. But when we drop the group names on it, the group numbers, we see that clearly they're both group 15, so we would not want to be using these 2 products together in a tank mix or in a rotational cycle. And the reason why I held that 15 back is because you wouldn't know otherwise if you don't pay attention to that. They are different active ingredients. They're different trade names. So this, the group number is an important aspect to keep in mind. So and this kind of come back to Adony when he mentioned what's the colors. So we see we have these shoot growth inhibitors and the chemical families. So we have chemical 8, which is a lipid synthesis, 15, which is a chlorocetamide. They're all within the shoot growth inhibitors. So we want to be trying to rotate these color schemes as well. And so what I handed you out earlier was the 11 most common herbicide groups. So you could use that to just refer to some of these so you could see the variety of trade names, the variety of active ingredients that are within these 11 groups here. So we see within this chlorocetamide there's Dual, Harness, Microtech, Outlook, Surpass, and Metachlor, Alachlor. There's completely different active ingredients, but they're all within the same chemical family, which I'm not a chemist, so I don't know what family they fall into unless I have a chart like this. So these are readily available online with the Weed Science Society of America, and a lot of this information about resistance is there as well. Sorry, this one's a little hard to see here, but another, just on that topic of herbicide resistance, first we have in this column management options, and then we have our risk of developing resistance as we move away from the columns here. So the first we have the herbicide mix or rotation, which we covered pretty extensively in the last slide. If we use more than 2 modes of action, we have a low risk of developing a resistance. If we're doing the repeated mode of action in the same tank or in a rotational cycle, we are going to have a high risk of developing a resistance. Moving into the different weed control methods in the cropping systems, we're going to have a low risk of resistance if we are utilizing the 3 forms, the mechanical, cultural, and chemical. So if we rotate those 3 forms instead of relying just on a chemical control method, we're going to reduce the resistance as well. So if we're just doing chemical over and over, again, we're in that high risk category. So we want to be looking at a more holistic, integrative method, as Alex talked about in the last seminar. Next, it's the same mode of action per season. We use the same mode of action one time, low risk. If we're going to repeat that again, we're going to have a high risk of resistance. We're going to skip a couple of these in the middle because they're not as related to herbicides as this talk is focusing on. But one aspect I do want to mention is this bottom row, which is control in the last 3 years. And this is an important aspect to think about as well, because if you're noticing that for the past 5 years prior, your control's been good, and then you notice that the 2 years before that, control's been maybe a little weaker, you're not picking them up, you're having some weed escapes, that's an important component to be thinking about. So if your control is declining over the years, then you might have resistance, so you want to talk to your local extension agent and see if we could figure out if you actually do have resistance or what you can do to stop that before it becomes a bigger problem. So back to the label. Now we're looking at the ingredients, even though we covered some of this before. So what we see in the Roundup is the active ingredient is glyphosate, and this is in the form of a potassium salt. So there's different forms in which we'll talk about in a minute. So it says the percentage of the active ingredient, 48.7%, along with some of the other inert ingredients, as well as some of these conversion factors. So the reason they have these conversion factors is a lot of times there's a restriction for how much chemical you could put down throughout the course of a season. And that's usually in pounds of active ingredient. So if you have 2.5 gallons of a herbicide, well, how does that convert to pounds of active ingredient? It's not just, you can't put that on a scale and weigh it. So you have 660 grams per liter or 5.5 pounds per gallon of the product. So that's your conversion factor, so you're able to transfer that weight into the active ingredient of the product. And another aspect here is that if you didn't know Roundup wasn't a liquid herbicide, if this is some foreign product and you just saw the label, you would be able to determine that this is a liquid product because it says 5.5 pounds per US gallon. So it's saying that this is gallons, so this is a liquid product. So I mentioned that the Roundup was in the form of the potassium salt. There are two, the most common forms are the potassium salt and an ester formulation. And they have very different uses, and they have appropriate times in which you should be using a salt or an ester. I generally prefer to use the salts because they have a lower volatilization and a lower vapor pressure. So what that means is that your potential for non-target exposure or drift is reduced. When you're using an ester, they have a higher pressure and it's greater potential for the volatilization or drift. So you would say, well, why would you want to use an ester if it's going to be more potential for drift? Well, the esters, they have a better capacity to penetrate the waxy cuticle of a leaf. So if you have a species that's hard to kill, in Hawaii this was really common, that a lot of our species, like Wedelia, had the Roundup couldn't penetrate it well. So the ester formulation was able to get right in and target the systemic pathways within some of those difficult to control species. So it's a little more risky to use, but in a lot of cases it's a hotter product or a more powerful formulation. And a lot of these companies, so you see this product is Garlon 4 Ultra. It's the ester formulation, but the label you have in your hand is Garlon 3A, which is the salt formulation. So they'll make a similar product just in a different form to give you different ability for uses. So now we're looking at the important phone numbers, just moving on our way through the first page of the label here. So what we have is a not very exciting component, but this is fundamental for your safety. If you have questions or need assistance with using the product, they have a number. And if you have a medical emergency or exposure to the product, of course you could always call 911 or you could call your doctor, but they give you a emergency contact. And you know it's important because they say you could call collect. They're not going to foot that bill if it's not an important aspect here. So day or night, you can call. I was going to call the other day actually and see what actually happens when you call these numbers, if you talk to a person or if you get a recording, but it slipped my mind.
Press 1 for English.
Exactly. As your Roundup's dripping down your body. And when you do, if you do have to make this call, hopefully you don't, it's good to have all the information you can, especially the EPA registration number. Because if you're going to call, they're going to need to know what it is, how to refer you to the proper personnel or the Poison Control Center. So if you could have the label or have the EPA registration number, the more information, the better they could help you. So moving on to the signal words. There are 3 general signal words in which we see on these pesticide labels. Specifically, herbicides, we don't see the warning as much. Is that, do you find that as well, Tim? Do you see warning labels much on herbicides? I see caution and danger all the time, but I don't feel like I see a lot of the warning. Insecticides, yes. So I pulled this from an impede label just because I can't leave it out. But caution is the least toxic of them all. Roundup is a caution signal word. Warning is moderately toxic. And then the most dangerous is the danger, or the skull and crossbones, and that's extremely hazardous. But regardless if it's a caution word or if it's Roundup that you're used to dealing with, these are all poisons. These are all pesticides. They're all toxic, maybe minorly, acutely toxic, but they're all toxic chemicals. And even if you are protecting yourself, you could develop a hypersensitivity to them. So I wasn't allergic to pollen when I was younger, and then I did some seed harvesting and I had a hyper reaction to it, so now I have a pollen allergy. The same thing can happen with using these chemicals. Prolonged acute exposure can develop a reaction and you could then become more allergic to it, or it could be more toxic to you. So even if it's caution, be careful, follow the guidelines and be safe with them. So the PPE, we've got a lot of it spread out, and Tim is going to spend some time talking about that after me because this in itself is its own presentation. There's a lot of information here and a lot of different ways you can protect yourself. So we're going to skip over this one. So moving on to the re-entry interval. We're all pretty aware of what this is. So this is the point from when you apply the chemical to when you can go into the treated site. On this label, it says pretty clearly, for an agricultural use requirement, do not enter or allow workers to enter the treated areas during the REI period of 4 hours. So a relatively short re-entry interval. We'll talk about the Garlon label towards the end, significantly longer REI period. So usually, especially for the ag use chemicals, it will be a duration. However, for non-crops or non-crop uses or non-ag uses, a lot of times it will be a physical state. So what that means is you can re-enter the area when dry. So it won't necessarily be, so if it's an application on a park or turf area or turf grass field, it's usually a when dry type of re-entry interval. So a little different than this type of time period. And not listed on the label specifically is the worker protection standards, which you need that worker protection training. But a good practice is the signage, which the worker protection deals with, putting appropriate signs around the areas you spray, marking out so other individuals know not to enter the treated zones and the treated sites, as well as recording and logging. This is an important aspect to, for the safety of yourself and the other individuals you work with, that they could come to a worker protection board and look at it and see what chemical was applied, what site it was applied at, the REI period, the EPA registration number, and all the information that one might need to know if they're going into a field. So it's just good practice to have those signage and those worker protection on the back of your mind. The storage for the products are, generally it's best to keep these in their original container. Sometimes it's hard, especially for the more homeowner type chemicals. I know I go to my parents' house and my mom has a jug of Roundup and she likes the sprayer on the Roundup. So she crosses out the Roundup and puts her bug spray in it and writes bug killer. You know, so when I see it I think, well, what can I do? But you want to try to keep these in their original containers just for your clarity, because that's what they're for. Their labels are on them. Keep them labeled properly. Put a date on it so you know when you get it, you know your expirations. A lot of these materials will separate and come out of suspension or solution. So it's good to be aware of when you got it, and so you can keep track of it. Store these away from food. Yeah, it's straightforward when we're talking about a 2.5 gallon jug of Roundup. But if we're looking at a ant bait or a cockroach bait or a decon, maybe not so clear, right? So we want to make sure we're conscious about where we're storing these and the safety precautions that come along with that. Keeping away from kids and animals, clearly this is an important component to remember. I've been just seeing so many dogs eat decon and those type of things, so be conscious of where you put them and where you place them, not just for storage, but for using them and applying them. Sometimes, well, you always want to keep them sealed. I don't recall even putting that in there. Yeah, you want to keep the lids on them, I guess is what I meant by that. Keep them in a chemical container, generally. The label doesn't specify that for a lot of the chemicals, but it's safe, it's good practice. A labeled chemical container, locked container is always my preference, but they don't always, it's not a regulation for most of these chemicals. And then for storage is best long-term is a dark cool. So you want to have the temperature as moderate without the daily fluctuations out of the direct sunlight, and that's going to be your best product efficiency, because most of these chemicals are, will break down with UV degradation, so the active ingredients will no longer be as effective and you'll lose your efficacy, so you want to keep them dark and cool. Dispose of them properly. There's always intricate directions on the labels. Generally it's a triple rinse, and they'll usually have a lot more information than I put up here, such as fill it full of water or 3/4 full, shake it for 15 seconds, turn it upside down, swirl it. They'll have a whole procedure of how to properly clean and dispose of the containers. And you always want to make sure you puncture these as well. Not the pressurized, but a plastic container. You want to make sure you puncture it so someone can't reuse that container. Pretty straightforward information, but important to remember. And the Department of Ag will always have on their website, the pesticide program, they'll have authorized disposal sites if you want to get rid of a chemical, or if you need to get rid of your containers in that way as well. So what we don't want to see in our storage is something like this. We don't want to have everything piled in there. Clearly this is unsafe. I always like to have my dry formulations above my liquid formulations, because if you have a wettable powder below and you have your liquid above, if that leaks, well, you're going to have two contamination. It's going to leak onto the wettable powder, and then you're going to have saturation. That's a problem. So I always like to keep my dry formulations above the wet. And the expiration dates. Pay attention to those. Look around, periodically go in with the intention of cleaning and purging these chemical storages. You want to go in and look for the cracked containers, anything leaking. These are caustic materials generally, so you want to look for corrosion. If you do see corrosion, it grows on itself, so you want to clean that off and try to keep it as hygienic or as together as you can. And a lot of times you'll go into these storages and there'll be a stockpile in the corner of these obsolete chemicals that you no longer use. Get rid of those things. Don't keep them around. If you know you're not going to use them, I've been in so many of these storages where someone said, yeah, well, we used to use that about 10 years ago. We don't use it anymore, but we still keep it around. ODA has these programs in the pesticide program which it's rotating. So if there's something you don't want, get rid of it. There's no need keeping it around. Purge and keep it clean for the safety of you and your workers and everyone who's dealing with that. So what we covered here so far is just basically 4 topics. Just on the Roundup label, we have 6 more to go, which luckily for all you guys today, we're not going to get into that. So we're going to shift gears slightly and talk about ways to reduce drift and drift management. So drift is the off-target contamination of plants, animals, humans. A lot of components play into drift, but really what it means for the applicator is that, one, your product's not going to be as effective. You're putting it on, it's not landing where you want it, so it's not going to kill the weeds, it's not going to kill the bugs. You're losing money when you do that. So say it's $40 an acre. If you're getting 25% drift, well, you're losing $10 an acre. So it's not only just a physical danger and a physical hazard, it's an economic loss as well. So what I have here is just a brief illustration. This was done in the mid-'80s, just about how quickly and how much drift can occur and how much volatilization when you're doing an application. So the particles are measured in microns. A human hair is about 75 microns. So what we have here is this 80 micron fine particle. So this is the very fine. The 200 is about a medium particle. So we have the fall distance on this axis. So 0 would be the boom height, where the nozzle is. And then we have the lateral distance in feet on the bottom here. So this is a pretty typical condition, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 55% relative humidity, very common of when you would spray around these parts. The only difference is not common here is this is a wind speed of 1 mile an hour. I doubt we generally spray when it's 1 mile an hour because it's always windy here. So we can see that with this very fine droplet with 1 mile an hour, it falls about 1.5 feet or 2 feet from the boom, and in that period, it travels about 6 feet before it volatilizes and goes off into a dust. So this isn't very far before from the boom to the ground, and it's going to move. You're going to spray at this height, and it's going to move over to that second row of seats. So very, very high drift potential. As you make the droplet more coarse to that 200 microns, which is around a medium spray, it's a little better, where you have the boom and you have about a 20-foot fall, and it's drifting about 8 feet. So that's a very important component. Just a small aspect or a small increasing of that particle size makes a significant difference in terms of that distance and that reduction of drift potential. So as I mentioned, there are a bunch of ways to reduce drift. I'm going to focus on one very specific aspect today, but spray timing and conditions are an important component. We want to be always watching the wind when we're doing these chemical applications. The least wind, the best. Sometimes we can't do anything about it, but we want to go early in the morning, so we try to, afternoons the winds pick up. We want to spray at the appropriate times. We want to have the relative humidity. Super dry days, it's going to be wicking that particle and causing more volatilization, as well as temperature. The hotter it is, the quicker those droplets dry out. So we want to be paying attention to all these factors as well. And the speed while applying is the same idea as wind. right? If we're going fast, we're going to create that vortex and that wind movement or the air movement, and it's going to be that same potential for drifting, as well as the appropriate boom height and nozzle spacing, as well as the direction in which the boom is spraying towards the ground. But what we're going to focus on today, and what I mentioned in that last slide, is reducing or increasing the spray droplet size, because this is in my opinion, the easiest aspect to kind of grasp and the easiest aspect to actually apply. And there are some pretty nice technologies that the companies are coming out with, which are impressive. So one aspect is to reduce the operating pressure, and that's what a lot of these nozzles are able to do. Secondly, you can put in adjuvants or surfactants or drift reduction additions to the tank. But we're going to look at choosing appropriate tips for this presentation for the rest of it. We've got a bit more time here, so we'll focus on that. So there's a number of options, and I'm sure this isn't new information for you guys and gals, but it's important to just think about the concepts here and to visualize it so you know what options are out there. Are there any nozzles that you have found have been effective, or what type of nozzles are generally in use? Are you using just normal flat fans, or are you using air induction? Okay, good. So this is kind of preaching to the choir, but for those of you who don't or you're not aware, the drift guard. So how this works is that there's the internal pressure, and the drift guard nozzles, they change the pre-orifice plate. So what we see here is a just normal flat fan nozzle, and we have this big hole right here. I almost said puka. Puka is what they say in Hawaii. They have the big puka right here, and the drift guard is a smaller hole. So what that does is it just reduces the operating pressure. So the pressure could still be at 40 psi or whatever your general application is, but when it gets into that nozzle tip, it's just going to reduce the pressure. It's like doorways, essentially. The more meandering you go through and the tighter that pathway is, the bigger the droplets are going to turn out. So a couple that I like are the Turbo T-Jet, and my favorite is the air induction, but there are all sorts of derivations of these products. So if you had a nozzle breeding program and you took the Turbo T and the air induction, their offspring would be the Turbo T induction. And this is essentially over and over what they have here. So we have the extended release, or the extended range, the drift guard, the Turbo T, the air inducted extended range, air induction, Turbo T induction, and then that quarter. I'm not that familiar with that quarter TTJ. Looks like it's a pretty interesting nozzle, but I've never used it. But what you see here is that as you're moving down and as you're getting these combinations, you see the droplet size is increasing as you're passing through. So the extended range, it's still a drift guard essentially, but it's almost a fog as you go down. It's coarser and coarser. And the air induction's nice because the way it passes through, when the chemical goes through that tip, it creates a Venturi action. So it sucks a little bit of air into it, and it makes an air-filled particle. So you have your chemical on the outside filled with a bubble of water, air, essentially. So when that hits, it expands and explodes, and so it breaks into a bunch of little droplets. Because the premise is a fog is better than a rain because you have more particles and you have more saturation and it moves around. But the air induction is a really unique technology which allows for it to pop and create a bunch of small particles upon impact. So this is just a comparison between the air induction and a drift guard nozzle, and you can see a significant difference, and relate that back to that graph earlier when you saw just the fine and the medium drift potential. This is going to make a big difference. Again, visually, just looking at these two, we have an extended range nozzle at 40 psi. So generally when you bump up that pressure, you get a lot more drift. Then you compare that with an air induction nozzle at 70 psi, significantly less visual drift here. And then comparing that with some crop injury with the extended range, it's not a very sharp line. So what that means is that we're getting a lot of drift potential moving away from where our target is. Compared to the air induction, this is a very nice crisp line, and that's exactly what we're looking for. We don't want to see that off-target damage. So good technologies to be utilizing here. So there are a lot of resources available at the ODA. They have, as Corey mentioned, he put a lot of the, some of the resources in his contact out there. But there's the pesticide program, which is storage, disposal. There's online links to the registration. There are various sites which you could search the EPA reg numbers or the trade names or the active ingredients and pull up the labels. So all that information is readily accessible to you. Label reviews, OSHA, which Tim will probably mention in terms of the personal protective equipment. And then the EPA has, and the Weed Science Society of America, they have extensive literature available for the reducing pesticide drift. So essentially, we want to follow the label, follow the guidelines, be safe, keep the chemicals effective, keep them available, because misusing these chemicals is just going to restrict the chemistries we have. And be conscious of when you spray, where you're spraying around, because the more people complain and the more complaints we get, the worse and the harder it is for everyone. It's a pain. I understand. I did a lot of work on the roadsides and DOT corridors. The public doesn't like it, you know, and infractions where they have to complain, it just makes it more difficult in general for everyone, and it puts pressure on the ODA to have to put more regulations. So be safe, we be courteous, we keep these products around for our use. So I'm going to skip by the questions real quick and go. Clearly it wants me to end here because this clicker's been working the whole time. And it's slide 36 of 44. Very interesting. I think the computer froze on the question slide. Geez, is that a sign or what?
So that means I don't have to. It should just.
Yeah, I think the computer froze. There we go. We got life here. Well, that would have been a bummer for having it on slide 1. Okay, let's just cancel out of that. Okay, well, let's restart this PowerPoint here. Well, in the meantime, we can ask a couple questions. So we have our Garlon label here. Everyone has your label. What we see is essentially what I went over. So if you look at the label, let's just answer a few questions here, and we have a couple little door prizes to keep the participation up here. So first, let's see, what's the trade name of the product? Garlon. All right. Well, who said it first? I heard it. You did. Okay. So that was an easy one just to get you started here. Can this product be used around farm buildings? Yes? Where does it say that? Right in the bold print? Absolutely. I heard the yes over here first. Mr. Seahawks? Good, you're wearing a hat, so you got another one. CPS Cozy. It's getting late in the day, about that time. So next question. What chemical group is the product? That would be awesome. If you could just close the program, yeah, that would be. Yes, group 4.
Can you do something not in bold?
Oh, we're getting there. All right, active ingredient? Triclopyr. Gotcha. What's the formulation of this product? That's not in bold. Yes. Yep.
Do you have anything more on that, like flowable or?
We could, yeah, we're going to be moved that direction. Now I was going to give these little question handout sheets, but we don't have tables in front of us, so. Okay. Thank you. So the, what is the form? We said flowable liquid, but is it an ester? What? Salt? Right, so we said the Garlon 4 is the ester formulation there. EPA registration number, we see that. Signal word, Danger. We went bold on that one. We went extra bold, so you got that one right. So is this product poisonous? Yes, very poisonous. It's the most, so what are our three categories? We have caution, warning, danger. Exactly. So how do you protect yourself from exposure to this? How do you... Exactly. So are you able to go into the area once you treat it? If it's an ag use area, what's the REI period? And what happens if it is a non-crop site? If you're spraying a park or doing some edging? Got it. Do you need to lock this product up when you store it? I heard some yeses, some nos. Let's see, where is this? Directions for use. No, you do not need to. I know that because I looked at it before and I'm trying to figure out where it is. Storage and disposal. Just says store above 28 degrees Fahrenheit, agitate before use. So it does not have to be kept behind a locked, labeled cabinet. Of course, I recommend that because that's just a good practice to lock it up so people don't get into it, people steal it, people expose themselves to it. So not required, but recommended. How do you get rid of the containers? So after you spray your mix, what do you do? Triple rinse. And how long do you shake it up for? Here we go. 10 seconds. Sorry, we don't have gifts, all around.
They're answering so
over
fast,
there.
so many of them.
And just so we know, we're saving the good gifts for Tim's presentation here. We got the real stuff. These are just little trinkets. Tim's he's got to keep you around and keep you happy towards the end. So that's what I have. I do want to show you just a couple videos. Oh, this is probably what bombed it here, so as I mentioned, the drift potential here. So the air induction nozzle, let's see. And essentially what this is illustrating is how's time going, Tim? Okay, 5. So what this is illustrating is the difference that it makes when it's windy out. So what we have is 40 psi, air induction. We see that coarse particle, a nice tapered fan here, and then we just add 5 miles an hour wind. Pretty insignificant wind. We see how much of that product moves away from where it was with the no wind. So the comparison, we see that nice even band with only 5 miles an hour wind. We see a lot of movement, a lot of drift. So same idea, if you have 5 mile an hour wind and you're applying at 5 miles an hour, your drift is going to be significantly greater. Let's see, skip back one slide here. So now we look at the extended range nozzle. Again, looking at the same difference that application speed and wind speed makes on the drift potential. So again, we see, opposed to the air induction tip, we have a much finer drop. Again, a nice tapered pattern in perfect ideal lab conditions, 0 wind. We add 5 mile an hour wind. We have significant drift coming off of that. So this gives an illustration of really what that difference makes and how much of that could move away from your target site and causing that non-target or off-target exposure. So a lot of product is moving away from where you want it to be. So keep that in mind when you're picking these nozzles, when you're picking your formulations, putting adjuvants in. Just be aware of this potential for drift and Spray safe for yourself and your neighbors. So any questions in the meantime? We have a couple more minutes, I believe. Thank you.
Corey wanted me to make one kind of announcement to the handouts out on the table. Are there any aerial applicators in the room here?